We talked about virtual machine scale sets Monday, 2 days ago, right? Only 2 days ago. Yeah. Wow. 2 days ago, and kind of talked about what they are, how you can use them. And we figured maybe today we should actually go in and build one of these and play around with not scale set, sorry, VMSS Flex, virtual machine scale sets Flex.
Yes, which are virtual machine scale sets. So there's this newer, if you haven't played with scale sets in a while, there's this newer deployment mode, because it's still a scale set, but you can set a scale set to be in what's known as uniform orchestration or flexible orchestration mode. And when you're in uniform orchestration mode, you have a set of workers or things that are all going to be the same. There's going to be uniformity across them. So I have a web server and it's Ubuntu, 20 dot whatever LTS, and it's got Nginx deployed on it and my custom SSL cert and my website. And maybe I host that behind a load balancer. But when I scale it in, scale it out, I always need that Ubuntu Nginx thing to be the same. So there's uniformity there. And then scale sets kind of provide that level of detail and get you to where you need to be. Sometimes you need like a finer grain in there and you're like, well, what if I have these, two web servers that are always running, but I really need like a third web server that's a sidecar for telemetry, or I just need some other kind of worker off to the side, but I want it to participate and adhere to the same health signals and availability models that are available with the rest of the virtual machines in my scale set. And in the past, that's been hard to do because scale set always implied uniformity. It implied some measure of all the things that I put in here are all the same. And now they get to use things like auto scale, scale in, scale out. They get to use all the health signals across update domains, fault domains, availability zones, all those kinds of things. And Microsoft will just kind of handle it for me as far as like placement and ensuring health and all that good stuff. Well, now you have this model where you can say, okay, I love uniformity, but I need some flexibility and uniformity. Like there's other things that I want to bring into the mix here, because really I'm not thinking about it as just like a single layer of my application. Maybe I'm thinking about it more as a set of components or a set of services that all need to have that same underlying management, health model, all those kinds of things. So that's what flexible orchestration brings, is you can get to this place where you have uniformity plus flexibility. So I can still have a scale set with, those base 2 servers, and maybe I have like a scaling rule that scales me from 2 to 5 or whatever it happens to be. But then I can bring in that third server and have it in a place where again, I can pick the availability zone, get it into the same fault domain, update domain model, all that good stuff for health signals. I can maybe do extension deployments or semi-uniformish things across it if I want to go ahead and you get it in place. So it's a model where you can either say, hey, I have strict uniformity, like, again, I've got that traditional whatever N-tier application, maybe like a 3-tier web app, middleware, and database layer. And those are all 3 different things that are managed independently when it comes to health and scale. Or you can kind of start to maybe mix and match within those layers if you wanted to, or really be more kind of component oriented versus layer oriented. I guess is how I would describe it. Maybe from like a roles and responsibilities of how your application actually composes and runs day to day.
Yeah, and Microsoft, and I'll flip over to the documentation here. Microsoft has like these 2 orchestration modes. So they've kind of gone through and outlined okay, you're looking to do this, that uniform and flexible orchestration mode that you talked about. And they walk through exactly what you had. What are those skill sets with uniform orchestration? It's workloads, identical instances, versus skill sets with flexible orchestration, high availability, scale. You can have identical or you can have multiple virtual machine types in these flexible orchestration modes. And then they do go through and kind of walk through what's changed within those. And I thought if you get down here far enough, a comparison. Here we go. This is the table I was looking for, and my Zoom is messing with the table. Oh, it's not my Zoom. It's the website. Scott, they need to go fix their website because I have
Noted. I'll go talk to the
Can you go
docs team.
update the docs team and say you have a scroll bar? But it does walk through and looks at, okay, flexible and uniform scale sets and availability sets all do have some differences. And I think we talked about this on the podcast, like when it comes to that maximum instant count. You can see those are widely different numbers, from 1,000 to 100 to 200 SKUs that are supported. Some of that control over your VM, your NICs, and your disks are in there. So when you're going through and thinking about which of these you want to use, you probably do want to go out and look at this comparison and make sure that your particular use case actually fits within the constraints of these flexible orchestration versus uniform orchestration, or just supported by availability sets.
Yeah, I think you'll find that flexible scale sets are, well, I mean, they're just that, right? Like they're flexible. So you can kind of them if you're thinking like, hey, I've read all this and the uniform model sounds like where I want to be, but you don't know what you don't know yet. You can still go with flexible because you do get that opportunity to have in flexible orchestration mode, uniform virtual machines, and then you can potentially over time grow into the flexible state. The other thing I'll call out, I think, is if you're somebody who's net new to this and you're going to like play around with it, and maybe you're net new to scale sets in general, and you go like, oh, hey, this sounds like a cool concept, I've never gotten hands on with it. Usually the place most folks go, I think, is things like quick starts and tutorials in the same set of docs that you're in. All of the quick starts and tutorials, or at least all the ones that I've run into lately, by default do deployments in the flexible orchestration model. So they kind of guide you right into that from the beginning.
So is there, and I'm kind of looking through some of these comparisons, is there anything that a flexible orchestration mode... Okay, so here's one. I found some down here. There are some things that you can still only do with uniform orchestration. Looks like stuff around like service fabric, AKS.
Though, yeah. So a lot of these things. So take like Service Fabric and AKS. Those are other managed Azure services, right? Those are IaaS/PaaS managed services. Yep. That's in Azure. Like, I don't know that you really care if those support flexible or uniform scale sets. Like, you're not doing that. You're going and deploying an AKS cluster. Like, whatever the AKS service team decided was the best deployment model, like they're going to go with that, and they're going to have their SLAs, and they're going to do their thing. So you're going to let that happen. Some things that might impact you here are particularly around identity. So if you kind of key in on that managed identity line, you can see that for VMSS Flex, so a virtual machine scale set created in flexible orchestration mode, you can only do user-assigned identities. You can't do any system-assigned identities. So for something like, let's take that AKS example. When you spin up an AKS cluster, you can create a managed identity as a part of creation of that cluster. You can create one later. And when you do that, Microsoft and the AKS service are creating an identity that's specific to that cluster that then you can grant rights to perform actions on other resources within your Azure subscription. Like, could be management plane or it could be data plane operations. Like maybe in the case of like AKS with a managed identity, I might give that managed identity access to a key vault so that all the secrets for my AKS cluster can be managed in key vault. Yep. And then that's just all automatic. So I delete the AKS cluster and all my permissions automatically get cleaned up because that identity went away. That doesn't happen in user assigned identity land. I don't know how big a deal, like if that's a deal breaker for folks. I don't know that it is. Like, depending on where you're coming from in your Azure journey, you might, like, I don't know, for some reason say like system assigned identities are a thing like you must have. I don't know that that's the case. Like, yeah, is there some extra operational overhead? Sure, but not a ton, right? Like in many environments that I guess I've seen, I'm sure there's like cases where you absolutely have to go one way or the other. But I think that's really the biggest difference between the two. Everything else, disk types, VM types, SKU availability, access to host your scale set behind an application gateway, a load balancer, compatibility with other services, all these things, like it all works with VMSS Flex the same way it does with Uniform.
Right. I mean, there's managed and unmanaged disks, but frankly, if you're using an unmanaged disk, you should stop anyways. So
so nobody should be doing unmanaged disks. I imagine that goes away over time. I think the writing's been on the wall for that one for a long time. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree. So does the user assigned, going back to managed identity, is it only user assigned due to the flexibility that you can have multiple SKU types in there, that it's just harder to do a managed identity because of the variety of VMs that you have in there?
It could be like there's some, I think, some weird things that you can do with VMSS Flex that you can't do with uniform scale sets and that deployment model or deployment mode, I guess. And one of those things, like you mentioned, is this ability to mix and match not just SKUs. So I could have like a 4-core 16 gig of RAM VM over here, and then I could have an 8-core 32 gig of RAM thing over here, and I could put those in the same scale set. Like that would work, and that's something you can't do in Uniform LAN. Like Uniform LAN, they all need to be the same exact SKU, same exact type of thing. In Uniform LAN, they also need to be the same OS. In VMSS Flex, you can mix and match operating systems. So like back to that use case earlier of I have a web layer that's doing some stuff. What if you run like your primary web servers on Linux, but then you had like a legacy Windows component that could only run on Windows? Well, with VMSS Flex, you can spin up the Linux servers and the Windows server and have them all running in the same place in this kind of happy-go-lucky land.
Yeah.
where anything goes. So I think that like anything goes mentality potentially has some limitations behind it. Over time, I imagine like that just gets cleaned up.
Right. Like, I guess I just think of, because managed identities are so closely tied to the resource they're created on, that when you start doing like a managed identity for a wide variety of resources, it just becomes a little bit more of a technical challenge. Like you said, they may figure out, okay, here's this series of things that we need to do system assigned managed identities. But when it's user assigned, you just have that flexibility in how you can assign it, permissions you give it, which, at least in my head, makes it easier to do a user assigned managed identity when you have something as flexible as VMSS Flex.
Yeah. Do me a favor, scroll down to that, scroll down
Scroll.
to that next section there. So you do have some differences when it comes to orchestration within these deployment modes as well. One of the biggest ones that I've seen when we think about like auto scaling is when you're using uniform orchestration, like your auto scale rules can automatically scale you in, scale you out, which means they're managing all those underlying instances and basically creating and deleting on the fly. And as part of that deletion process for an instance, they're doing things like deleting NICs and hard drives as well. In VMSS FlexLand, you have to go an extra step to give yourself some level of instance protection, or ensuring that the actual flexible non-uniform thing in my deployment is going to remain available for all time. Because you don't want to have, say, I'll go back to that example. So I have 2 Linux servers and I have a Windows server, and they're all sitting in the same scale set. So my Windows server is like the odd person out in that scenario. When I scale out, say I have a scale rule that takes me from 3 to 5 instances. Well, I've already got 3 instances. Those new instances, when they come up in a scale rule, are going to be based on the uniform configuration of that scale set. So I had 2 Linux servers that were uniform, 1 Windows server that was, different. So when I scale out, I'm going to go up to 4 Linux servers and 1 Windows server. And that's okay, great. What happens when you scale in, though? Because the scale set doesn't really know that, like, oh, this Windows one is really important and it needs to be here all the time. But meanwhile, there's just random cattle over here, right, that we can go out into the field and we can kind of call. And so if we scale in, like, hey, let's just get rid of 2 of those. So what you have to do is things like add resource locks to your virtual machines, so that you're getting instance level protection at the VM level. So that way, when a scale in rule happens and you're at 5 machines, 4 Linux and 1 Windows, you still want that 1 Windows one to always be there. You put a resource lock on the 1 Windows one, and that way, if the scale set orchestrator tries to delete the Windows one, it can't do it. It basically moves on to the next one, and it'll say, oh, hey, great, I just hit a uniform one, I can delete that. Well, let me get rid of it and do what I need to do. The other option that gets added when you're doing virtual machines in a flexible scale set is you end up with these kind of attributes that you can configure at deployment time of your virtual machine around other resources that you might want to stick around. So a VM in Azure is never just a VM. The virtual machine resource is the resource that defines, like, what's the OS, how much CPU, how much RAM, like what's the SKU, family of this VM, all those things.
Yep.
There are other resources that get associated with the VM but aren't a VM. So things like a network interface or a NIC, or your hard disk, like your OS disk, or maybe any data disks that you attach to that. Those are all separate resources as well. So I don't know if people have noticed over time, like, if you do virtual machine deployments through the portal, and you're familiar with the old experience and you haven't seen the new one, there's little checkboxes in there now for when you deploy virtual machines, particularly in these flexible orchestration scale sets, where you have like a checkbox to not delete your NIC and not delete your hard drive when a VM is deleted. So I think some of that is born out of, did a customer read this documentation and did they know they had to put resource locks on their non-flexible VMs in a flexible scale set? Probably not. But by default, the checkboxes for retain my disk and retain my NIC are enabled as well. So if you did forget to do something like a resource lock, you can always go back and recreate that VM pretty quick, because you'll still have all the disks that were associated with it, the NICs and those underlying configurations, things like that.
Yeah. Kind of hints to that up here, like in that top section where you have that option to delete or retain. In those flexible ones, you have an option. You can choose to delete the NIC, delete the disks when the VMs gets deleted or not, versus a uniform one where it's always going to delete the NICs and the disks. But then down here, again, to your point, you do have to make sure you check it as that. Where did I see it in here? Auto remove NICs and disks when deleting VM instances is yes. So I'm assuming this is that they're selected by default, or no, you said they're unselected by default. This is a little confusing then in that documentation. So this is auto remove on the uniform ones, but by default, your one-offs should actually be no for this.
It depends on your deployment mode, and was your deployment and I guess when I say deployment mode, where was your deployment done from? How did you execute that deployment? Did you do it through the portal? Like the portal, I don't know if you've noticed when you deploy things through the portal, there's always way more verbosity and a bunch of other defaults that are selected that don't always get done when you do things in PowerShell or the CLI or just in an ARM template, right? Like I live in storage land all the time. So for me, there's just things that I'm used to in storage because I'm always doing demos for customers in the portal and things like that. Like we have a set of logical defaults around data protection for storage accounts. We enable soft delete and all these things by default. But if you don't do your deployment through the portal for a storage account and you just take an ARM template with the minimum viable number of options that you need to create a storage account, we don't enable any of that stuff by default. Same kind of thing over here. You need to be, to a certain degree, you need to be intentional about these things and really think and have some intentionality behind the deployment when you're pushing it out. So if you go through the portal, my experience has been those things are checked automatically for you when you're saying, hey, I'm doing a flexible VM in a flexible scale set. But if you're coming through, Bicep, ARM template, CLI, PowerShell, whatever that is, all bets are off. You have to know that you want those options and then enable those options.
Okay. Yeah, I like that option from a cleanup perspective. I also like not auto removing from, to your point, a DR option, because I actually did have once where I was going in and cleaning some stuff up and accidentally deleted a domain controller. Fortunately, the disk and the NIC didn't get deleted, so I just recreated it, attached the NIC and the disk, and my DC came right back up like I had never deleted it. But there's also been times where I've deleted
it's
a
not
VM.
Bad, right? When it works, it works.
And then there's also been times when I've deleted a VM and forgot that I didn't delete the NIC and the storage, and in particular the storage. It kept charging me, and I go back 4 months later, and I'm like, why are these disks still out here for this VM I'm not having anymore? So it is. I like that option on VMs. Scale sets, absolutely pay attention to it. But even just VMs in general, think through how you actually want those. Don't just blindly take the either automatically delete or not automatically delete when it comes to those, because pros and cons to both options.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's networking this all
those are really the biggest
same.
differences that I can think of. There's some things with networking, outbound connectivity, NSGs, all those kinds of things. But I think most of us are used to those from, just general VNet and subnet configurations, all those kinds of things. There might be some limitations there. Basic load balancer not available in VMSS Flex. You should all be using standard ones anyway if it's a production thing. So don't worry about it. Right? That's a don't sweat it or worry about it.
Backup recovery, a lot more backup and recovery options. But yeah,
because these are single instance VMs now, right? It's but it happens to be a VM that lives within the same modality for health and placement, think fault domains, update domains, availability zones, as the other uniform things that you put in there.
That you got. Yeah, so it sounds like do you think the uniform will go away eventually, and eventually it'll just be a VM? Everything will be VMSS Flex. It'll all be flexible. All the same functionality will be there, and it'll be more of how you configure your scale set versus what orchestration mode you choose.
One would hope, right? Just for simplicity, but who knows?
Yeah. Some FAQs, pretty basic there, kind of around some of number of VMs. Interesting. Any other documentation you want to look at, or you want to go create one of these?
No, we can go play around in the portal a little bit. So I think if folks are going to do this on their own, the portal might not be the best place to start. If you're well, it depends, I guess, on the mode you learn in. Like if you're more like a CLI person, all the documentation for this stuff readily puts you into CLI or PowerShell. I think it's helpful, just kind of the first time to go through the portal and just see what the portal's doing and how it's doing things.
Yeah, because that link at the bottom of Get Started, it dumps you over to deploy your applications on a virtual machine scale set, and it goes right into CLI PowerShell. Like there's no
it
UI
dumps you
guidance
into
here.
Totally the wrong place. If you go back to the left to the nav and you go into quick starts or tutorials within docs there, that's
quick starts.
Really
okay.
Yeah. So now you see like, hey, create in the portal. If you go into like tutorials, expand tutorials real quick, just in case anybody else is following along, create and manage, boom, CLI and PowerShell. Pick your poison, go. Click on like the PowerShell one and you'll see it walks you through your step-by-step, like create a resource group with PowerShell. Great, created a resource group, create a virtual machine scale set. Now, note, this isn't create and manage with VMSS Flex versus Uniform, but by default, like I said earlier,
right,
they're using flexible orchestration for everything.
Got it. So it's just a parameter on the new AZ VMSS is what that orchestration mode is.
It is an attribute or a property that is associated with the scale set, not necessarily the underlying VMs in that scale set, which I think is an important distinction.
Interesting. I'm kind of surprised, like under quick starts, they have Bicep, that there aren't more create and manage type stuff with Bicep, although I suppose if you're just doing a single scale set, there's not a lot here. I was just kind of looking through capacity.
There's not a lot there.
All right. Yeah, let's jump over into the portal. So here, we'll jump over, get your screen up there, and let's play around with the portal and see what we can do.
All right. Let's do this. So I'm going to go ahead and let's just kind of do it. Let's see, virtual machine scale. Let's see what that gives us. Hey, great. We've got VM scale sets. We're working at the speed of the cloud now. Let's go ahead and create one of these. All right, and let's put this in a new resource group. We'll call this our to the cloud RG.
So this is all pretty standard scale set details, region, availability zones.
Yep. So this is going to be my to the cloud VMSS. Great, we'll put that in. So I think this is kind of like the money area here when it comes to this radio button. So what is your deployment model and what are you going to be in? So Uniform, again, like everything's the same, servers as cattle, all that good stuff. Or do we want to be flexible? Now, this thing right here, this is a binary decision. You can either be uniform or you can be flexible. You can't be both at the same time unless you choose flexible from the beginning. So that's all to say, like, it's a property that's created and locked at the time you create your scale set.
So you can't
it's
go
not
and
something that you
change this later. Once you pick it, it's done. You
correct.
Create a new one, delete and recreate if you want something else.
Yep. So that's basically how that one comes up. Let's just do a couple of Windows servers. Yeah, small disk is fine in here. Sure, we'll do some little mini VMs.
So it didn't look like, at least on this page, any of your options change at this point in time if you're doing uniform versus flexible. That's the only difference, or the only thing that has changed. I know, like, sometimes if you choose one option versus another, you'll have maybe some different properties you have to fill out, different things that are required. Here, uniform and flexible on this page are the exact same configuration, other than which radio button
that's
is
it.
selected.
Like, I'm still gonna deploy a base VM. So if I change this back to uniform, it doesn't change any of the underlying options for me. Like, I want to make sure that property is like set at the time that I'm creating my scale set. And because I'm creating virtual machines, like if nobody's ever done this through the portal, a lot of the setup for VMSS starts to look eerily familiar to setting up a virtual machine, because you have to get at least that first instance deployed and up and running. So if you've just done a straight VM deployment, it's like basics, disks, networking, management, boom, 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 review and create. Same thing here, basics, disks, networking. And it's going to be a little bit different with scaling because we're dealing with a scale set, but that's okay. So we really don't need to do anything with our disks here. We're going to let this thing kind of spin up everything new for us. It's going to create a new VNet. It'll create subnets. You can totally bring your own. That's not an issue at all. If you want to bring a load balancer, you can bring a load balancer with you, like an existing load balancer. You can go ahead and create a new one. Just keep in mind that limitation. I don't know if it's locked in the portal. I haven't tried it. But that limitation of not being able to use basic load balancers with VMSS Flex, like you can only use standards. For now, let's just leave this as none. We could always add one later if we wanted to.
Disks and networking, because we're setting up that base VM, not the one-off. That's also why we're not seeing those options around deleting or not deleting NICs and disks at this point in time, because that base one that's going to scale in, scale out, it's going to delete the NIC and the disk because you're scaling that base one out. We're not dealing with a one-off at this point in time yet.
Yep. So let's go ahead and look at that. So we got scaling. Let's say we want to do 2 instances. We'll leave it as manual scale for now. That's fine. Our scale policy is going to be just defaults. So we're locked here in that there's no scale in policy support because of flexible orchestration. Like that's okay. We can work around all that stuff later. Management, we don't need to do anything with like cloud in it or anything like that. Diagnostics, we'll leave enabled. We'll let it do its own managed storage account. OS updates become interesting. So there's a capability within Azure for doing auto OS patching for your virtual machines, be they Windows or Linux, anything like that. So in this case, because this is the uniform VMs in my flexible scale set, I don't get things like auto patching on those. But if I do a flexible VM later within that scale set, I can totally go ahead and get that to where it needs to be. So we got that out of the way. Let's take a look at health. We don't need health monitoring or anything like that. Like we could, if we could totally kind of configure whatever we wanted and, do probes on a web server, availability of a certain executable, things like that. Don't worry about it. We're going to let Azure figure out how to spread my VMs around across various availability zones, fault domains, all that good stuff. Typically for like a uniform VM, it's a little bit weird going through the portal experience here because I'm just going to do like bog standard. Hey, here's a Windows server. But usually your uniform VMs do have additional post-deployment things on them. Like if I'm deploying a Linux server and I want to have Nginx on it, Nginx is something that I need to install on that server post-deployment and post-boot. So I might have like a cloud init script or a virtual machine extension that runs like a bash script or something like that along the way. Dedicated host support is available for both uniform and flexible virtual machine scale sets, as is proximity placement groups or PPGs. So should you decide to do that stuff, that's all available to you. So this is kind of like the quick and dirty configuration of a virtual machine scale set. We got all our options there. We'll go ahead and click create and let this do its thing. So this deployment, as it runs, is going to take a hot minute because it's doing a lot of things. It has to not only create the virtual machines and all those other associated resources, because a VM is never just a VM. It's a NIC and it's disks and all the other stuff that comes with it. But it's also got to, in our case, create this virtual network, all the subnets. It has to deploy the scale set itself. So there's kind of this basic, dependency flow that you'll go through as all the stuff deploys. So this will probably take like 2 or 3 minutes to spin itself up and get everything started. So we'll wait until at least the scale set has deployed, and then we can go kind of poke around and look at that a little bit.
Go look at it while the VMs get created within the scale set and all that. Hopefully the cloud's speedy today, Scott. Did you feed the cloud its coffee this morning?
I try to. I'm certainly like cranking back my coffee over here, as I tend to do. I don't know if you've noticed this quick kind of sidebar about virtual machines in Azure. Have you noticed that deployments are getting faster for VMs?
I have not, but I'm trying to think. I have not deployed a VM in a bit, I don't think.
So I've noticed, like, my experience has been virtual machine deployment speed, especially in hero regions. So like really big Azure regions like East US, North Europe, Dublin, things like that. In the hero regions, deployments are getting much faster. Like, yeah, I remember, years ago when I used to do training and we'd do like the virtual machine labs. It was a hurry up and wait exercise. Like, all right, let's create a VM. Everybody get to the point where you click the create button. Now let's walk away for 10 minutes and go get a new cup of coffee. And now stuff tends to be on the order of like sometimes less than a minute. I've seen some of the smaller VMs come up. So I think like, stuff's definitely happening to make that deployment experience just a little bit faster.
Sure.
So, and this was pretty quick, right? To actually go ahead and create at least our scale set resource and get that done. So we can see our scale set now, and I'm browsing into that actual scale set resource. Yep. I get all the regular things that I get with what you'd be used to as a normal scale set if you've not deployed one of these. And over here, I can see here's my orchestration mode, and I'm in that flexible mode. If we go look at instances, I can see my 2 VM instances were deployed and they're all up and running already. Like they're all set and ready to go. I've got my networking here. This is great. Was all good, ready to go. I'm doing a manual scaling thing here. So like we started with 2 instances and it spun up 2 instances. Let's say I want to do 3 instances. I can just change that number like you would in any other scale set. And I come over here and, I've still got 2 instances, right? Like nothing came in for me automatically. So we'll get that solved in just a second. Size, this is interesting because they're going to be all the sizes that are out there, because all families, all SKUs, all sizes for a flexible orchestration scale set. We've got our termination. We didn't do PPGs or anything like that. Upgrade policies, there's not going to be much for us to do there. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. The boot diagnostics for our VM resources that are available to us on this side, like all easy enough to get into should we need to.
Yeah,
so there's my third instance.
Right? Yep.
Nice and quick, right? Like all that stuff just kind of, well, I mean, it just kind of works and gets to where it needs to be. I can do custom auto scale within this. So this is just like in a regular uniform orchestration, like, hey, how do I want to do auto scale? Is it based on VM health, application health, some other thing? Maybe I do it time-based, anything like that. You can see the run history for all your scale in, scale out events. You can configure diagnostics, like once you have auto scale up and running.
Got it.
All nice and easy to get started.
Can you set your scale in policy here now? Because I remember you couldn't set scale in when you configure. Okay.
You can't, because it's in that flexible
in
orchestration
flexible
mode. So even if I do custom auto scale in policy still isn't going to
got it.
be available to me. Yeah. So maybe that's one of those limitations. I don't know how important like a bespoke policy is versus just like take me in and take me out, and then I put a resource lock on top of things, and
right.
it's all better that way. All right.
Got it. So we have all of
Mm-hmm.
these. I haven't seen yet. How do we actually add like that one-off now? Because everything we've shown is still pretty traditional VM scale sets. In order to get a new VM, we're scaling up, scaling down. But I don't see adding a one-off. I want my Windows VM in there, Scott.
Well, you got a couple Windows VMs in there, but let's see if we can get
I want
a
my Linux
different
VM or a different Windows. I didn't pay attention to what OS you selected.
All right, so let's go look at virtual machines.
I want my Mac OS VM in there. Can you put a Mac OS VM in Azure?
Can you put a Mac OS VM? You cannot put a Mac OS VM in Azure. You can do that in other clouds like AWS, licensing limitations and all that stuff there.
Does it? So I didn't know AWS even had them.
They do. I think because of macOS licensing limitations, you have to run them for 24 hours. So I think I deployed my scale set into EastUS. So I'm going to say virtual scale set. There's my taking a step back, while you were talking, I clicked into just create a regular virtual machine. Okay. Like I didn't do this from the scale set side of things. This is just regular VM
create a resource. But now in that scale set, it will show anything. I'm assuming any scale set that's marked as flexible that you could go select and deploy this VM into.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So just to make my life easy, in case I need to get on one of these, I'm going to do what I shouldn't do and just set passwords on these things. That's fine. So this is standard VM create experience. Really, the only difference is I said, here's my scale set that I'm going to target.
Yep.
For this virtual machine to go ahead and go into. So, again, standard options for all the things here. And this looks eerily similar to that VMSS create experience, with the difference between networking and management. There was a scaling tab within the portal, but this is just a regular VM now.
And so I saw on your disks now, when here on your NIC, you have that option selected to, the disk was automatically delete. The NIC is to not delete. So there's a inconsistency with what it's deleting with the VM.
But I can
control it, right? By default, it's selected, but then networking by default it's unselected.
Yeah, it's a little weird, right? Like,
but pay attention.
Portal experiences for you.
Pay attention to it. That's the moral of the story.
Yep. So I'm just going to leave this. I already had that VNet created. It had its single subnet. We've got our to the cloud one-off here. So fine.
This is 100% a one-off. Like, this could even be in a completely different VNet, subnet, everything from those uniform machines.
I haven't tried it in a different VNet. I don't know if the portal locks you into a given configuration.
Got it.
Because maybe they'd be worried about crosstalk and communication.
Okay.
You probably could and should be able to, because I don't really think about this as like a networking construct kind of thing. Right. It's really about virtual machine availability and VM health in context of the other things that surround it. So I keep mentioning hey, fault domains. It's because fault domains and fault domain spread and management of where your VMs land within a given fault domain are managed by the scale set. So that's kind of what you want, right? Like if I'm in FD1 for VM1 and FD2 for VM2, when VM3 comes up, I would really love that to be in FD3. So we just let Azure manage that and get it to where it needs to be. I'm just going to leave all this stuff in its defaults. Monitoring, sure. You can give me boot diagnostics. Advanced, gonna look eerily similar to things. We're not doing dedicated host, no tags. Review and create. And we'll go ahead and hit the create button. And this should take, another minute or two while it spins up. Hopefully it doesn't take too long because it's just a little itty bitty VM.
Right. Good job on not missing any properties, Scott. I'm like 50-50 on when I get to the validation on if it says, you forgot to do this.
Interesting thing about the Azure portal. So maybe for folks who don't play around in the portal a lot, the Azure portal is 99% of the time nothing more than an ARM template expression generator. So like that whole experience walking through all those tabs and, going basics, networking, management, all those kinds of things, it was all to get to the point where you could get to that validation screen. And on that validation screen, what's happening is the portal is building out the JSON for your ARM template, and then it's bumping and submitting that ARM template against an actual validation API. So if you ever write like ARM templates from scratch, you can actually call the validation API on your own and try it out, and that all works. And so all it did was generate a template, and that template has a bunch of things, right? Just like any ARM template would. Right. It has variables and parameters and inputs and outputs, and it submitted that template deployment on my behalf, and here's the deployment and what it did within it. And then I can go ahead and go to that resource, right? Like it's done. So one of the things I like to do, like when I'm playing with like a new service, like in this case, if I had never seen VMSS before, and like my inclination would be like, okay, let me play with it in the portal and just see like how it's supposed to operate, what the defaults are supposed to be. And then I would get to the point where I'm like, okay, cool. Now I want to automate it, and I want to do it with PowerShell or with an ARM template, things like that. I always tend to do things in the portal first, and then take those extracts of the auto-generated templates and just see like what options they set, like. What properties and attributes were populated. All those kinds of things. So our VM is up and running. Let's go back to our virtual machine scale set and look at our instances, and look at that. We've got our one-off instance, which is sitting right in there. Oops. Getting click happy.
I saw it there for a second. Instances, there we go.
And just like that, like it is up and running, it's done its own thing. If we go look at some of those other things, like scaling, like remember when I set that scale rule to 3 and it created a new one? Well, it automatically knew, hey, 4. I wanted to add another VM to it. Yep. So let's go ahead and add that to 4. So if I change this to 5 now, like let's go up one more. What this is going to do is it's going to go out. And if I look at my instances over here and refresh this.
So that's interesting that it sees it as an instance in the scale set and bumps it up to 4, but it's not one of those uniform VMs. So your instance count, depending on how many one-offs you have, could be, I don't know that I want to say deceptive, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the uniform number of VMs. It's the total number of VMs.
Yes. Yeah. So that's where you need to be careful, particularly with the scale in stuff and like getting rid of instances. So let's kind of like work through that one real quick. So we're still scaling up and we're going out to 5 instances. I can see that one's created. Yep. So I'm going to take this over here. So what I need to do with this one is I need to say like, this is important to me. Like this thing can't go away. So let me call this my one-off lock. And I'm going to lock this as a delete lock. Boom, boom, boom. So what I'm saying here is on this virtual machine resource, I'm putting a governor in, like a resource governor in place at the ARM level. So if anybody tries to come in and delete this virtual machine using an ARM operation, which back to the portal and the underlying services are all just ARM generators, right? ARM expression generators. It's going to hit this and it's going to say like, okay, I'm going to try and delete you. And then it's going to fail because it had the lock on it. If it doesn't have the lock on it, you're kind of not in a great space. You better make sure that you set those options to not delete your NIC and your OS disk.
Right, because I'm assuming here, is there a pattern to how it deletes? Like, is it a whole last in, first deleted type thing when you scale, or is it kind of random in terms of which one it picks to delete? So if you would bring this back down to 4 and you didn't have the resource lock on, it may or may not delete the one-off. If you brought it down to 3, probably a better chance that the one-off might get deleted. If you go down to 2, you're just increasing the chances that your one-off will get deleted if that resource lock isn't there.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and try it real quick. So I put that resource lock in place. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to take this and I'm going to scale this into 3 instances. And let's hit save and wait for this to crank through for a hot second. Great. Let's go back over to our instances here. And we'll just start a refresh button because we're impatient.
Always.
And we should see this kind of start to delete some instances here within a couple of seconds, hopefully. I always love the caching in the portal. Like you never know.
I've noticed that more and more, not even in just portals in general, Azure and Microsoft 365. I have become much more liberal in the amount of times I click my refresh button because it seems like there is a lot of caching that goes on across anything that shows up as you jump between screens, pages, whatever it may be.
Yeah. So it looks like instances are going away. I did see one of them go away pretty quickly there. Yep. So we're definitely down to just those 4, and we should see that other one drop out of here shortly. Let's see if it tried to delete this VM.
I was going to ask, it will show in the log then if it tries to delete it and fails.
It's an ARM operation, so it doesn't look like in this case that it actually tried to delete that one at all.
Or at least it hasn't tried to delete it yet. We still have 4 in there, Scott. I'm waiting to go to 3.
Yeah, we might need to take it lower. I just need to wait for this one scaling operation to finish. You can do it. Let's take it down to 2. Let's play with fire. But you can see, like, even if we don't see it in the activity log, like I think it's still important to call out that resource lock thing is basically a requirement. Like if you go down this path, like you definitely want to do that and have a delete lock in place on that VM resource. Or if that VM resource lived in another resource group, like I happen to put this to the cloud one-off VM in the same resource group as my virtual machine scale set and the other instances. I didn't have to do that. I could have deployed it someplace else if I wanted to. So I can implement that resource lock at other scopes as well. Like I could do it at a resource group level if that VM lives someplace else, but it just so happened to be like, hey,
there goes another one.
This is a one-off and easier to go. Yeah.
So you can have like a VMSS Flex one-off resource group that it's like, okay, anytime you create one of those one-offs in VMSS Flex, it goes in this resource group, which by default has a lock in every VM that gets put in it.
Correct. Yep. So this will keep doing its scaling thing over time, but I know we're just about at time.
Yeah.
And I think this gives a good sense of like what it does and how to get in there and manage some of it. like I think the next quick stops, if somebody's watching this and you go like, okay, great, that's fine, we can deploy VMs, blah, blah, blah. Like you actually get into the whole like uniformity model of virtual machine scale sets. Go create a VM image, use that image as the common like uniform deployment, which then gets you into image galleries and a bunch of other different things along the way, just to be able to play with all that.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see this go down to 2, Scott. When it hits a lock, it won't, and I guess this is kind of why I'm curious to see it go down to 2. It's not hitting that lock and saying, I can't get down to 2 because I'm trying to delete a locked one, is it? It should hit the lock and then skip it and try to delete a different one.
Let's send it to 1. Yes. Yeah, it's not that it'll skip it, it's that it'll try and delete it.
And it says,
then
I
it'll
can't
say,
delete this one, go try another one.
Yeah, and it'll move on to the next one that's out there. And I haven't spent a ton of time playing around with like this side of it. Like this seems a little wonky. Like even though I'm saying like, hey, take me down to 1 or 2 VM instances, like it is trying to retain something in there.
Right, like it's deleting, every time you take it down, it's deleting one easily, and it's like it's getting stuck on another one.
Well, because it's always got this n+1 model, right? Like
right,
I've given
it's
it
like a little goofy.
Yeah, I always have the +1 kind of thing running in there. So let's see. Yeah, that was our create.
So it should be those 3, right? Creator, update, were those? Oh, there it goes. Now I got it.
Yeah. So I think it's always going to try and leave me
1,
with
right?
like I took it down to 1, and it looks like it's always trying to leave me with at a minimum like my +1 that's sitting out there.
So this would be really odd if it went down.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, there's a deletion that failed.
Yep. So it tried to do it and it couldn't. So move on to the next one.
Interesting.
Which is good, right?
Right.
Like the resource
okay. So yeah, that was 6 minutes ago. But I bet it won't ever take this down to 1, because that would mean you don't have any uniform VMs in your scale set anymore.
Yeah, I imagine there's some like weird back-end logic there that I just don't know about how it works through the portal or whatever. It'd be another thing to go and play with a little bit more.
Yeah. Hey, my screen sharing stopped, and what happened over there?
You broke that hours ago.
Did I break it hours ago?
Let's see. Yeah, at least 37 minutes ago, 27 minutes ago, something like that.
27 minutes ago, I broke the stream to Discord that nobody was watching.
Yeah. So it looks like with this, yeah, it's always going to leave that +1 in there. Like it's never going to take me below the 1 uniform instance on the scaling side.
Got it. Huh. Interesting.
So that is a quick and dirty tour of VMSS Flex.
All right. Well, thanks. That was fun to get in and play with. I have not played around with that yet. So thanks for the quick and dirty tour of VMSS Flex.
Yeah, you got it. We'll see you on the next one, Ben.
All right. Sounds good. We'll see you later.